The fog off the ocean was thick enough to choke on when I opened my front door at 6 in the morning. Standing there, shivering in the cold, was my granddaughter holding a plastic bag and a crumpled note that said, "We decided you keep her." My son and his wife thought they could discard her like trash after destroying my life years ago. They made a mistake. I am not just taking the child. I am taking everything else. My name is Eleanor Whitlock. I am 58 years old, a widow living on the jagged edge of Marrow Bay, where the Atlantic Ocean slams against the cliffs with a violence that usually soothes me. For the last 3 years, silence has been my most expensive luxury. I paid for it with a broken heart and a severed family tree. After my husband died, and after the disaster with my son, I retreated here. The house is old, sturdy, and uninviting to strangers, much like its owner. I drink my coffee black while watching the fog roll in, thick and grey, erasing the horizon line until the world feels like it ends at my porch railing. It was a Tuesday, just past 6 in the morning. The sun had not yet burned through the mist. The pounding on my door was not polite. It was frantic, a heavy, desperate rhythm that did not belong in my quiet life. I set my mug down. I was not expecting a delivery, and I certainly was not expecting visitors. My hand hovered over the deadbolt. In Marrow Bay, unexpected knocks usually meant bad news or a tourist looking for the highway. I pulled the door open and the cold wind rushed in, biting at my ankles. I looked down. My breath caught in my throat. Standing on my welcome mat was Amelia, my 6-year-old granddaughter. She was alone. She wore a thin denim jacket that was entirely insufficient for the 50-degree weather. Her knees were bare and knobby, shaking violently. Her small hands clutched a cheap, white plastic grocery bag that looked like it contained everything she owned in this world. Her eyes were red-rimmed and wide, filled with a terror that no child should ever know. She did not speak. She just shivered. I fell to my knees instantly, ignoring the ache in my joints. "Amelia," I whispered. She flinched when I reached for her, and that flinch cut me deeper than any knife. Pinned to the front of her jacket with a safety pin was a folded piece of lined notebook paper. I recognized the handwriting immediately. It was sharp, angular, and rushed. Clarissa, my daughter-in-law. I unpinned the note, my fingers trembling with a mixture of shock and rising fury. I unfolded it. The message was brief. "We decided you take her. Do not contact us." That was it. 7 words to abandon a child. 7 words to upend my life. I looked from the paper to the little girl standing in the fog. The wind whipped her hair across her face. I pulled her inside and slammed the door against the cold, locking it tight. As I wrapped a wool blanket around her shoulders, the shock began to recede, replaced by a cold, hard anger. My son, Marshall, and his wife had been spiraling for years. I knew they were chaotic. I knew they were selfish. But to drive out here, drop a 6-year-old off like an unwanted bag of donations, and drive away, this was a new depth of depravity. I went to the window and peered out through the lace curtains. The street was empty. The fog had swallowed whatever vehicle had dropped her off. My heart hammered against my ribs. Why now? For 3 years. Clarissa had kept Amelia from me like a prisoner, using the child as leverage, as a weapon to hurt me. She had screamed that I would never see my granddaughter again. So why, on a random Tuesday morning, would she hand over her greatest bargaining chip? Something was wrong. Something was terrifyingly wrong. I looked back at Amelia, who was sitting on my floral sofa, staring at her feet. This was not an act of mercy. Clarissa did not do mercy. This was a disposal. They had tried to ruin me before. They had drained my accounts and slandered my name until I fled to this coast to survive. They thought I was just an old woman they could use and discard. They thought they could dump their problems on my doorstep and disappear into the mist. I crumpled the note in my fist until my knuckles turned white. They made a grave calculation error. I was not the same woman they broke 3 years ago. I walked into the kitchen to heat up some milk, my mind sharpening into a weapon. I would take care of Amelia. I would protect her with my life. But as for Marshall and Clarissa, they had just started a war they were not equipped to fight. Watching Amelia sip her warm milk, the steam rising around her face, I felt a ghost walk through the room. It was the ghost of the man my son used to be. Before Clarissa, Marshall had been kind, the sort of boy who brought stray dogs home and called me every Sunday just to hear my voice. We were partners in grief after his father died, a small, fortified unit against the world. But Marshall was soft, and soft things are easily reshaped by hard hands. Clarissa was granite and glass. She was beautiful, but her ambition was a starving thing that could never be fed. She did not marry Marshall because she loved him. She married him because he was malleable, a stepping stone she could use to climb to a lifestyle she felt she deserved. I watched, helpless, as she isolated him. It started slowly. She mocked his hobbies until he abandoned them. She criticized his friends until he stopped answering their calls. And then, inevitably, she turned her sights on me. The financial bleeding began within months of the wedding. First, it was $5,000 for a down payment on a luxury car they did not need. Then it was $10,000 for a business venture that Clarissa swore was guaranteed to succeed. I gave it to them because I loved him, and because I was terrified that saying no would mean losing him. But Clarissa was clever. She took the checks with one hand and poisoned Marshall's mind with the other. She told him I was controlling. She claimed I used money to manipulate them. She rewrote history until my generosity looked like tyranny. The final fracture happened 3 years ago. It was an afternoon I replay in my nightmares. I was babysitting Amelia, who was just a toddler then. She had been running in the garden and tripped over her own feet, scraping her forehead on the patio stones. It was a minor accident, a simple scrape that required a bandage and a kiss. But when Clarissa arrived and saw the small mark on Amelia's head, she did not comfort her child. She seized the opportunity. She accused me of leaving Amelia unattended near the street. She told Marshall I had been asleep, or worse, that I was becoming senile and dangerous. She constructed a narrative where I was a threat to their daughter's safety. It was a lie so bold and disgusting that I could not find the breath to defend myself. I looked to Marshall, begging him to know me, to trust the mother who raised him. But he did not look at me. He looked at his wife, and he nodded. He told me to leave. He said I was no longer allowed near his family. That was the moment I realized I had to vanish. I could not fight a woman who had no conscience, not when my own son was her weapon. I sold my home. I took what little remained of my sanity and my savings and fled to Marrow Bay. I chose the company of the cold ocean over the heat of their betrayal. I told myself I left to protect the memory of my husband, to keep our past from being further tainted by the poison Clarissa spread. Now, looking at the little girl curled up on my sofa, the old pain throbbed in my chest, dull and familiar. But beneath the grief, something else was igniting. a cold fire. I remembered how it felt to hold Amelia when she was an infant, how her tiny hand would grip my finger with surprising strength. We had a bond that even Clarissa could not legislate away. Having her here felt like a vital organ had been returned to my body. She was the only innocent thing to come out of that wreckage. But as I watched her small shoulders rise and fall with every breath, the warmth of reunion was chilled by a sharp, nagging suspicion. Clarissa viewed people as assets or liabilities. That was the only math she understood. If she had given Amelia to me, it meant my granddaughter had become a liability. Or worse, she was bait. I was not just looking at a lost child. I was looking at the calm before a very violent storm. I had lost my son to their madness, but I would be damned if I let them destroy my granddaughter too. The old Eleanor, the one who walked away to save herself, was gone. The woman sitting in this room was ready to burn the world down to keep this child safe. I pulled the wool blanket tighter around Amelia, trying to stop the tremors that were still racking her small body. I needed to be gentle, but I also needed answers. I sat on the edge of the coffee table, bringing myself down to her eye level. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the distant sound of the ocean churning against the rocks. I asked her why they brought her here today. I asked her what happened at home. Amelia did not look at me. She stared at her sneakers, picking at a loose thread on her jeans. She started talking in short, broken sentences. She told me that Daddy broke the big vase in the hallway. She said Mommy was screaming about time running out. It sounded like the usual chaos of their marriage, the kind of toxic drama I remembered well. But then she said something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. She said the strangers came into the house. I froze. I asked her who the strangers were. Amelia shook her head. She said they were men in dark coats. She said they stood in the kitchen and did not say anything. They just watched Daddy count things. This was not a social call. This was an invasion. I tried to keep my voice even. I asked her what her mother told her before they put her in the car. Amelia looked up at me then. Her eyes filled with a confusing mix of hope and fear. She said they told her I would take better care of her than they could. It was a lie. It was a polished, shiny lie designed to make a 6-year-old girl feel less abandoned. But I knew the truth. Clarissa hated me. If she admitted I could care for Amelia better, it was only because she had no other options left. I looked at the white plastic bag Amelia had dropped on the floor. It looked like a bag from a cheap corner store. I reached for it, expecting to find a change of clothes or maybe a favorite stuffed animal. I dumped the contents onto the rug. There were no toys. There was a single pair of socks, a toothbrush, and a thick stack of crumpled papers shoved hastily to the bottom. I picked up the papers. My hands started to shake. These were not drawings or homework. They were financial documents. I saw a foreclosure notice for their house in the city dated 2 weeks ago. I saw credit card statements with balances of over $40,000, all past due. But the most terrifying thing was a piece of notebook paper tucked between the bills. It was handwritten in thick black marker. It said simply, "We are done waiting. Next time we take something you actually like." I stared at the note. The threat was physical. It was immediate. Suddenly, Amelia gasped and shrank back into the sofa cushions. She pointed a trembling finger toward the bay window that overlooked the front yard. I whipped my head around just in time to see a shadow move past the glass. It was a figure, tall and broad, moving quickly away from the house toward the road. Someone had followed her, I did not scream. I did not panic. I moved with a speed I did not know I still possessed. I rushed to the front door and threw the deadbolt. I ran to the windows and yanked the heavy velvet drapes shut, plunging the room into semi-darkness. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. This was not a family dispute. This was not just a bad financial patch. Marshall and Clarissa were in debt to dangerous people, and they had just dropped their daughter off at my house. I realized with a sickening jolt that they did not bring her here to save her. They brought her here to hide her. Or worse, they brought her here to distract the wolves chasing them. They had painted a target on my back and left their child in the center of the bullseye. I turned back to Amelia, trying to mask the terror on my face. I told her everything was going to be fine. I told her we were playing a game called Fortress. But as I spoke, the cell phone I kept on the kitchen counter began to buzz. It vibrated against the granite surface, a harsh, mechanical sound in the quiet room. I walked over to it. The screen lit up. There was no name. It was a number I did not recognize, with an area code from 3 states away. I stared at the glowing screen, my hand hovering over it, knowing that if I answered, I would be inviting the nightmare inside. I let it ring. The phone finally stopped buzzing, leaving a silence in the room that felt heavier than the fog pressing against the windows. I did not pick it up. I did not panic. Instead, I felt a cold, familiar clarity wash over me. The part of me that was a grieving mother had to step aside. The part of me that had once managed the complex logistics of my late husband's shipping business woke up. I walked into my study, opened my laptop, and sat down. If I was going to fight this war, I needed to know the terrain. I still had access to the trust fund account I had set up for Marshall when he was 21. He had likely forgotten my name was still on the administrative side of the ledger. It was a back door, but it was all I needed. I logged in, and the screen filled with a cascade of red numbers that made my stomach turn. The financial history was a roadmap to ruin. I traced the withdrawals. They were erratic, desperate, and telling. There were cash withdrawals of $2,000, sometimes $3,000, made at odd hours like 3 in the morning. The locations were clustered around the industrial district of the neighboring city, a place known for warehouses that hosted illegal card games and underground betting rings. Marshall was not just bad with money. He was gambling. He was chasing losses. But Clarissa was the darker shadow. I switched tabs to search public records and deeper financial databases. It took me 20 minutes to find what I was looking for. Her name was flagged in a preliminary investigation by the state financial regulatory body. It was not just debt. It was fraud. She had been moving money between shell companies, likely trying to hide the hemorrhage caused by Marshall's gambling, or perhaps funding something even worse. I thought about the men Amelia had seen in the house, the strangers. They were not guests. They were collectors. And in that world, collectors do not carry clipboards. They carry threats. I went back to the bank statements. I needed to see where the rest of the money was going. That was when I saw it. Amidst the chaos of overdraft fees and liquor store charges, there was a consistent, rhythmic transfer. Every single month, on the 15th, a transfer of $1,500 went to an account I did not recognize. I clicked on the transaction details. The recipient was a woman named Elena Rostova. I sat back in my chair. I had never heard that name. Was it a mistress, a blackmailer, or someone Clarissa was paying off? The name sounded foreign, perhaps Eastern European. It did not fit into the suburban social climber life Clarissa tried so hard to project. Marshall had a secret, a big one, and it was bleeding him dry just as fast as the casinos. I needed verification. I picked up my landline and dialed a number I had not called in 5 years. Frank Miller was a retired detective who used to play poker with my husband. He owed me a favor for keeping his alcoholism quiet back in the 90s. He answered on the 4th ring. I kept it brief. I gave him the names: Marshall Whitlock, Clarissa Whitlock, Elena Rostova. I waited on the line while he typed. I could hear the click of his old keyboard. When he spoke again, his voice was dropped an octave, stripped of any friendly pleasantries. He told me to listen to him carefully. He said that Clarissa was not just being investigated for fraud. She was being looked at for laundering money for a group that operated out of the port. And Elena Rostova. She was connected to a loan shark ring that did not sue for non-payment. They collected in blood. Frank asked me where I was. I lied. I told him I was visiting a friend in Florida. He told me that was good. He told me to stay there. He said that people involved with Rostova tend to have accidents when the money stops flowing. I hung up the phone. My hands were steady, but my blood was ice cold. The money had stopped flowing. Marshall and Clarissa had run dry. That was why they dumped Amelia here. They were not saving her. They were shedding weight so they could run. I looked out the window. The fog was shifting, and for a second, I thought I saw headlights cut through the grey mist at the top of the hill. They knew where I lived. Marshall knew where I lived. And if Marshall knew, the people who owned him knew too. I was not just babysitting a 6-year-old. I was harboring a fugitive from a crime syndicate. I closed the laptop. It was time to stop investigating and start fortifying. It was exactly 2:17 in the morning when the motion sensor floodlight in the backyard flickered on, cutting through the darkness like a blade. I was not asleep. I had been sitting in the kitchen in the dark, watching the perimeter of my property, and the sudden burst of light confirmed my worst fear. We were not alone. I did not turn on any interior lights. That would have made us targets. Instead, I moved with the silent precision my late husband had taught me years ago. I hurried to the living room where Amelia was sleeping on the sofa. I placed my hand gently over her mouth before shaking her shoulder, stifling her gasp as she woke. I whispered to her that we were playing the quiet game, the most important game of her life. I scooped her up, her small body radiating heat and terror, and carried her to the pantry. Behind the shelves of canned goods was a false panel that led to a reinforced safe room, a relic from the days when my husband's business rivals were less than civil. We sat in the absolute dark of that small steel box, listening. I watched the grainy feed from the security camera on my phone screen. A man was prowling through my backyard. He was dressed entirely in black, his face obscured by a hood and a mask. He did not try to force the back door. He was not here to break in, at least not yet. He was here to send a message. I watched as he walked to the mailbox at the end of the drive, his movements aggressive and jerky. He ripped the metal flap open, shoved something inside, and then turned toward the camera mounted above the garage. He stared right into the lens for a chilling second before reaching up with a crowbar. The screen went black. We stayed in the safe room for another hour. Amelia fell asleep against my chest, but my heart was hammering a rhythm of pure adrenaline. When I was certain the sun was beginning to rise and the shadows had retreated, I ventured out. I went straight to the mailbox. Inside was a single sheet of paper torn from a notepad. The message was scrawled in thick, angry letters. Pay what they owe. I stared at the words. The cold ocean wind whipped my hair around my face, but I hardly felt it. This confirmed my theory. They did not just want money. They wanted restitution. And they believed the means of that restitution was here, with us. They thought Amelia was the key. Clarissa and Marshall had not just hidden her here, they had sent her here with the package. I rushed back inside and locked the door. I woke Amelia and asked her to stand up. I needed to check everything. I emptied the plastic bag again. Nothing. I checked the lining of her denim jacket. Nothing. Then I looked at her wrist. She was wearing a bracelet I had not paid attention to before. It looked like a cheap trinket, a woven red string with a thick, plastic charm in the shape of a heart. It looked like something you would win at a carnival. But as I examined it closer, the weight felt wrong. The heart charm was too heavy, too rigid. I asked Amelia where she got it. She touched the red string protectively. She told me Mommy gave it to her right before they put her in the car. I went to the kitchen drawer and grabbed a paring knife. With careful, steady hands, I pried the plastic heart open. It popped apart with a snap. Nestled inside the cheap plastic casing was a tiny, black rectangle, a micro SD card. My breath hitched. This was it. This was the debt. This was the reason men in masks were stalking my home. Amelia looked at the card in my hand and whispered something that made my blood run cold. She said Clarissa told her that if bad things happened, she had to keep the bracelet safe. She said Clarissa told her that as long as she had this, Mommy and Daddy would be safe. They had turned their 6-year-old daughter into a mule, a courier for their dangerous secrets. I felt a wave of nausea roll over me, followed immediately by a surge of pure, white-hot rage. They did not care if she got caught. They did not care if the people chasing them found her. To them, she was just a hiding spot. I took the card and walked to my desk. My hands were shaking, but I forced them to be still. I slid the card into the adapter and pushed it into the side of my laptop. A dialog box appeared on the screen instantly. It did not show files. It showed a single blinking cursor and a prompt asking for a password. I tried the basics. I typed in Amelia's birthday. Access denied. I typed in the date of Marshall and Clarissa's wedding. Access denied. I tried the street address of their old house. Access denied. This was not a simple folder lock. This was high-level encryption, the kind used by people who have things to hide that are worth killing for. Amelia was watching me from the doorway, twisting the red string in her fingers. She looked so small, so fragile. She believed that piece of plastic was a magic shield that would protect her parents. She did not know it was actually a target painted on her back. I looked back at the screen. The cursor blinked at me, mocking my ignorance. I did not know the password, and I certainly did not have the software to force my way in. But I knew I could not give this to the police yet. If I handed this over, and it contained evidence that Marshall was an accomplice to something heinous, I would be sending my own son to prison. I needed to know the truth first. I needed to see the monster in the face before I decided how to kill it. I sat back, staring at the glowing prompt. I was going to break this code. I was going to open this box, even if it meant unleashing hell. It took me 4 hours to crack the encryption. I did not use a sophisticated algorithm or a hacking program. I used intuition. I realized that Clarissa was a creature of vanity and obsession. I typed in the name of the woman receiving the monthly payments, Elena, and the screen flashed green. The folder opened. My heart was pounding against my ribs as I clicked on the first file. It was a video, grainy and shot from a low angle, likely from a phone propped up on a table or hidden in a bag. The timestamp indicated it was recorded 3 weeks ago. The image resolved, and I saw them. Clarissa was sitting at a metal table in what looked like the back room of a warehouse. Across from her sat a man I did not recognize, but the way he held his cigarette told me he was not a banker. And there, in the corner, huddled in a chair like a frightened child, was my son. Marshall looked terrible. His skin was grey, his eyes darting around the room with feral panic. I turned the volume up. Clarissa's voice was clear, steady, and terrifyingly cold. She was pushing a stack of documents toward Marshall. "Sign it," she said. Marshall shook his head. I heard his voice, thin and breaking. He said he would not do it. He said he did not take the money. Clarissa laughed. It was a sharp, cruel sound. She leaned in. She admitted it right there on the recording. She told him that of course he did not take the money. She did. She told him she had moved $500,000 out of the organization's holding accounts into offshore shells. But, she explained, someone had to pay for it. Someone had to be the face of the theft. And that face was going to be his. I watched in horror as the pieces fell into place. Clarissa had not just spent them into debt. She had embezzled from a criminal syndicate and framed her own husband to cover her tracks. The organization had found the discrepancy, and they wanted their money back. Clarissa was offering them Marshall as the thief. The video cut to the man across the table. He told Marshall that he had 48 hours to return the funds, or they would start taking payments in flesh. Clarissa sat back, looking untouched, looking innocent. She had orchestrated the entire scene to have video evidence that Marshall was the one being interrogated, reinforcing the lie that he was the culprit. I clicked on the next file. It was an audio recording, dated only 2 days ago. The night before Amelia arrived on my doorstep. The sound of shouting filled my quiet study. I recognized the acoustics of their kitchen. Marshall was screaming. He was begging. He yelled that he would not do it. He said he would not drag his mother into this. He said he would not send Amelia away. Then, Clarissa spoke. Her voice was low, venomous, and devoid of any maternal instinct. She told him he had no choice. She said that the organization was coming for collateral. She said that if he did not put Amelia in the car and drive her to Marrow Bay immediately, she would call the collectors herself and tell them exactly which school Amelia attended. I stopped breathing. The room spun. She threatened her own child. She used the threat of her daughter's kidnapping or murder to force Marshall's hand. In the recording, Marshall broke down. I could hear him sobbing. He was weak. Yes. He was a coward. Yes. But he was trying to protect his daughter from the monster he had married. Clarissa told him that sending Amelia to me would buy them time. She said the collectors would spend time looking for the girl, and while they were looking, she and Marshall could disappear. I looked over at Amelia, who was sitting on the rug, colouring in a book I had bought for her years ago. She stopped colouring and looked up, her eyes wide. She had heard the voices from the computer. She whispered that Daddy cried a lot that night. She said Mommy told him that if they kept her, the bad men would take her away forever. I closed the laptop, my hands trembling with a rage so profound it felt like it might burn the house down. Amelia was not here for a vacation. She was not here because they trusted me. She was a decoy. Clarissa had thrown her daughter into the wolf's den to distract the pack while she made her escape. Amelia was the pawn Clarissa sacrificed to save her own skin. I looked at my granddaughter, innocent and terrified, and I realized the war had shifted. I was not just fighting for custody anymore. I was fighting a woman who had forfeited her right to breathe free air. Clarissa thought she was the smartest person in the room. She thought I was just a helpless old widow. She was about to learn how wrong she was. The silence that filled the room after I closed the laptop was heavy enough to crush a person. For 3 years, I had told myself that Marshall was weak, that he had chosen his wife over his mother because he lacked a spine. I had wrapped myself in that bitterness like a warm coat against the Marrow Bay chill. But the audio recording I had just heard stripped that coat away, leaving me shivering in the cold truth. Marshall had not abandoned Amelia. He had saved her. He was a man drowning in a sea of his wife's making, and with his last gasp of air, he had pushed his daughter onto the only life raft he could find. Me? I looked at Amelia. She had curled up into a tight ball on the rug, her thumb hovering near her mouth, a habit she had broken 2 years ago but had now returned to in her distress. She whispered for her daddy. She asked if he was coming. She did not ask for her mother. That omission spoke louder than any scream. She was terrified of the woman who was supposed to nurture her. My heart broke, not just for the little girl on my floor, but for the years I had wasted in self-pity. I had run away. I had let Clarissa drive me out because I was too proud to fight a dirty war. I had left Marshall alone with a predator, and now he was being eaten alive. Guilt is a useless emotion if it does not lead to action, and right now, I had no time for useless things. I picked up the phone again, my thumb hovering over the emergency dial. The instinct to call the police was overwhelming. It was what a law-abiding citizen does. But I was not just a citizen anymore. I was a target. Frank's warning echoed in my ears. If Clarissa was laundering money for the kind of people who leave threats in mailboxes, then the local police might be too slow. Or worse, they might be on the payroll. If I handed over the evidence now, Clarissa might tip off the organization before the handcuffs were on her wrists. They would come for Amelia to silence the loose end. I put the phone down. I could not trust the system. The system required paperwork and warrants and time. I did not have time. I had a 6-year-old girl and a micro SD card that was worth millions of dollars in stolen funds. I walked over to Amelia and knelt down. I did not promise her that her parents were coming. I could not lie to her. Instead, I told her that I was here. I told her that nobody was coming through that door unless I opened it. She looked at me, her eyes searching for a crack in my armor, but I let her see only steel. She leaned into me, her small head resting against my shoulder, and in that weight, I felt a shift in the universe. I was done being the victim. I was done being the sad widow who lived by the sea. I stood up and walked to the bathroom to splash cold water on my face. I gripped the edges of the porcelain sink until my knuckles turned white. I looked at my reflection in the mirror. The woman staring back had grey hair and lines etched deep around her eyes. But the fear was gone. It had been replaced by a cold, calculating resolve. Clarissa thought she was playing a game of chess, and she thought she had already taken all my pieces. She thought I was just an old woman who would fold at the first sign of trouble. She forgot that I was the one who taught Marshall how to walk. She forgot that before I was a grandmother. I was a mother who would tear the throat out of a wolf to protect her cub. I needed a plan. I could not just hide. Hiding was what prey did. I needed to become the hunter. I had the evidence that could destroy Clarissa and the organization she stole from. I had the leverage. I just needed to figure out how to use it without getting us killed. I wiped the water from my face and stared straight into my own eyes in the glass. I am her grandmother. I whispered to the empty room. And I will fight for her. My phone rang again at 7:19 in the evening. The sun had set, plunging Marrow Bay into a darkness that felt absolute. I looked at the screen. It was Clarissa. This time, I did not hesitate. I pressed the record button on the screen and put it to my ear. Her voice was unrecognizable. The polished, arrogant tone she usually wielded like a weapon was gone, replaced by a jagged, breathless panic. She told me Marshall was gone. She said he had vanished an hour ago, leaving his phone and his wallet on the kitchen counter. She claimed she did not know where he was, but the tremor in her voice suggested she knew exactly why he had fled. Then came the demand. She told me to bring Amelia to the old ferry terminal. She said she could fix everything if I just gave her the girl. She promised that they would leave the country, and I would never hear from them again. I gripped the phone tighter. I asked her why she needed Amelia to flee. I asked her if she intended to trade her own daughter for safe passage. Clarissa screamed. It was a raw, animalistic sound that made Amelia look up from her colouring book. Clarissa called me a stupid old woman. She told me I did not understand the kind of people I was dealing with. She said there was a contract on her head, and now that Marshall was gone, they were coming for the next leverage point. She said they were 5 minutes away from my house. I hung up. I did not say goodbye. I saved the recording. I looked out the window. Twin beams of light cut through the fog at the top of the driveway. A large black SUV was rolling slowly down the gravel road, its engine growling low and menacing. They were not 5 minutes away. They were here. I did not panic. Panic is a luxury for people who have options. And I had none. I grabbed Amelia's hand and pulled her up. I told her we were going on an adventure. I told her we had to be as quiet as mice. I grabbed the laptop and my purse. Then I led her not to the back door, but to the utility closet in the hallway. When my husband and I bought this house 30 years ago, we discovered it had been built by a paranoid rum runner during Prohibition. Beneath the floorboards of the closet was a trap door that led to a narrow, reinforced tunnel exiting into the dense woods behind the property line. I had never told Marshall about it. I certainly never told Clarissa. I threw the rug aside and yanked the iron ring. The door groaned but opened. I ushered Amelia down the wooden ladder into the damp, earthy dark. I followed her, closing the trapdoor just as I heard the sound of glass shattering in the living room above us. They were inside. We moved through the tunnel in total darkness. Amelia was whimpering, but she kept moving. I held her hand so tight I feared I might bruise her, but I could not let go. We emerged 10 minutes later in the thicket of pine trees behind the neighbour's property. I did not stop. We walked a mile through the cold, wet underbrush until we reached the main road, far away from the men tearing my house apart. I flagged down a taxi near the gas station, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I gave the driver an address on the other side of town. We were going to see Elias. Elias was a retired investigative journalist who had spent 40 years exposing corruption in the state capital. He was the only person I trusted to understand what I was carrying. When we arrived, He looked at us disheveled, muddy, and terrified, and simply opened the door wide. I sat Amelia in his guest room with a cup of hot cocoa and went into his study. I handed him the laptop with the decrypted drive. Elias watched the video of Clarissa and the interrogation of Marshall. He listened to the audio recordings. He read the financial logs. He sat back in his chair and let out a long, low whistle. He told me this was not just fraud. He said this was a federal case. He said the man in the video was a known lieutenant for an organized crime syndicate that the FBI had been trying to nail for a decade. He told me the contents of that card were enough to put Clarissa and her associates away for life. But as relief began to wash over me, Elias looked at me with grim seriousness. He said that if Clarissa knew I had this, she was not just desperate. She was a cornered animal. He said she would burn everything to the ground to get this card back before the authorities saw it. I looked at the screen where Clarissa's face was frozen in a sneer. She had lost her husband. She had lost her money. And now, she was about to lose her freedom. I knew Elias was right. The woman who had called me was not just scared. She was lethal, and she was still out there, somewhere in the night, looking for the daughter she planned to trade for her life. Elias handed me a burner phone he had pulled from his safe. It vibrated almost instantly. The number on the screen belonged to Marshall. I answered it, keeping the speaker low. His voice was barely a whisper, cracked and dry. He told me he had jumped out of a moving car near the interstate. He said he was bleeding, but he was coming for Amelia. He begged me to tell him where we were. I hesitated. My own son was asking for his daughter, but 3 years of betrayal had built a wall between us that even his desperation could not scale. I told him nothing. I hung up. Elias looked at me and grimly confirmed what we both suspected. The tracking software on his laptop showed Clarissa's signal pinging off a tower less than 2 miles away, but behind her signal, there were 3 other distinct pings moving in a predatory formation. The syndicate had tracked the card, or they had tracked Clarissa, and now the entire war was descending on Marrow Bay. We could not stay in the house. It was a cage. I made a decision that terrified me. I took the micro SD card out of the computer. I told Elias to keep the digital copy ready to send to the FBI, but I was going to use the physical card to draw the fire away from him and Amelia. I sent a text to Clarissa's number. I told her to meet me at the old commercial fishing docks at the south end of town. I knew the syndicate was monitoring her communications. I was inviting everyone to the party. The drive to the docks was a blur of adrenaline and fear. The fog had rolled in thicker than I had ever seen it, turning the world into a wall of white cotton. When we arrived, the air smelled of diesel and rotting fish. I told Amelia to stay close to me, to hold my coat and never let go. Then the headlights appeared. It was absolute chaos. Clarissa's sedan screeched into the parking lot, followed seconds later by 2 black SUVs that blocked the exit. Men poured out of the vehicles. I saw the glint of metal in their hands. I grabbed Amelia and ran toward the maze of shipping containers. We were small, and we knew the terrain. But panic is a blinding force. A gunshot cracked through the air, shattering a nearby window. Amelia screamed. We scrambled over wet pavement, ducking behind rusted machinery. In the confusion, a forklift roared to life somewhere ahead, cutting off our path. I spun around, reaching for Amelia's hand to pull her toward the walkway, but my fingers closed on empty air. I spun around. She was gone. The fog had swallowed her. I screamed her name, abandoning all caution. I ran blindly through the mist, my heart hammering against my ribs like it was trying to break them. I heard footsteps pounding on the metal grating of the pier. I followed the sound, my lungs burning with the cold, damp air. I found them at the edge of the pier, where the wooden planks met the churning black water. Clarissa had Amelia. She was not hurting her, but she was gripping the child's arm with a manic desperation, trying to drag her toward a small motorboat tied to the piling. Amelia was fighting, digging the heels of her sneakers into the wood, sobbing for me. I stepped out of the shadows. I held the memory card up in the air. I yelled at Clarissa to let her go. Clarissa froze. She looked at me, her hair wild and her face streaked with mascara and sweat. She did not look like the composed socialite who had sneered at my furniture 3 years ago. She looked like a ruin. She screamed that I had ruined everything. She said she needed Amelia to bargain for her life. I walked closer, keeping the card visible. I told her she was pathetic. I told her she was using her own child as a shield because she was too cowardly to face her own mistakes. Clarissa laughed, a jagged sound that cut through the fog. She yanked Amelia closer. She shouted that it was always about me. She said she hated me from the moment she met me because Marshall looked at me with respect. She said she wanted to be the only woman in his world, the only one who mattered. She admitted she isolated him, broke him, and stole his money just to prove she could win. She did not steal the money for luxury. She stole it to feel powerful. She looked at me with pure, distilled hatred. She said I could keep my moral high ground. But she was taking the girl because Amelia was the only thing she owned that had any value left. I took another step. I told her she owned nothing. And I told her the FBI was already downloading the files. Clarissa's eyes went wide. The distant sound of sirens began to wail, cutting through the fog, getting louder with every second. She looked at the boat, then at Amelia, then at me. The choice she made next would define the rest of her life. The sirens were not just coming from the road anymore. They were screaming from the water too. Just as the men from the black SUVs raised their weapons, ready to turn the pier into a slaughterhouse. I pressed the send button on the phone Elias had given me. It was done. The evidence of the laundering, the fraud, and the syndicate's operations was flying through the digital ether to the local press and the FBI field office. Suddenly, the night turned into day. Enormous floodlights from a police harbour patrol boat blinded us from the waterside, and tactical teams swarmed the parking lot. Voices boomed over loudspeakers commanding everyone to get on the ground. The syndicate enforcers, realizing they were trapped, dropped their weapons instantly. But Clarissa did not drop to her knees. In her panic, she revealed the person she truly was. She did not shield her daughter. She did not hug her. She shoved Amelia hard toward the approaching officers, using her own 6-year-old child as a distraction so she could try to scramble up a ladder to the upper deck of the pier. Amelia stumbled and fell onto the wet wood, looking back at her mother with a heartbreak that was absolute. She finally saw it. She saw that to her mother. She was nothing more than luggage to be discarded when it got too heavy. Clarissa did not make it 3 steps. 2 agents tackled her to the ground. I watched as they pulled her hands behind her back. She was screaming about immunity, blaming Marshall, blaming me, screaming that she was the victim. It was a pathetic end to a vicious reign. Then I saw him. Marshall stepped out from behind a stack of crates near the warehouse entrance. He had his hands in the air. He looked beaten, thin, and exhausted. An officer moved to cuff him, and he did not resist. He looked across the chaos, past the lights and the shouting, and his eyes found mine. Then he looked at Amelia, who was sitting up, trembling. He did not call out to her. He just nodded, a single tear cutting through the grime on his face. He was weak, and he had made terrible choices. But in the end, he had loved her enough to lose her so she could be saved. I ran. I ignored my bad knee and the slippery planks. I reached Amelia and scooped her up into my arms, burying her face in my coat so she would not have to see her parents in handcuffs. She gripped me so tight I thought she would never let go. The legal battle that followed was surprisingly short. The evidence on the card was irrefutable. Clarissa was facing 20 years for multiple counts of fraud and child endangerment. Marshall accepted a plea deal that included prison time, but he testified fully against the syndicate and signed full custody of Amelia over to me without hesitation. 6 months have passed since that night on the docks. The fog has finally lifted from Marrow Bay. The air is crisp and smells of salt and pine. I am sitting on the porch, watching Amelia play in the sand. She is building a castle, not a fortress. She laughs now. It is a real laugh, not the quiet, fearful sound she made when she first arrived. I walked down the steps and sat beside her. She looked up at me, wiping sand from her nose. She asked me if I was going to leave her too. I pulled her close, smoothing her wind-blown hair. I told her never. I told her that some people get lost, but she was home now. I looked her in the eye and said the words I had promised myself I would say when the nightmare was over. You were not left behind. You were found. Amelia smiled, and for the first time in years, the sun broke through the clouds completely, turning the grey ocean into a sheet of sparkling blue. We were safe. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I would love to hear where you are tuning in from today, so please leave a comment below and share your thoughts on Eleanor's journey. If you enjoyed this story, please make sure to subscribe to Grandma's Family Diary, like this video, and hit that hype button to help us get these stories out to even more people.